Ballpark Nation presents. Welcome to Go Astros, your look at the two-time World Series champions from three guys who have been here since Art Howe had hair.
And welcome everyone to Go Astros, where our Astros have go and gone. And for the first time in 7 years, we're watching the ALCS without a single dog in the fight. With us, as usual, is Andy Tom Chesson from Houston, Texas, and Brian Arbor, also from Houston, Texas, by way of up there in New York. Brian, we'll start with you. The Yankees have pretty much won the ALCS, I'm assuming, from their perspective.
I believe they said they won it when the Astros were eliminated because the one team they can't beat in the ALCS is the Astros. So go Astros.
That's actually kind of true. It's so funny. I was watching, Andy, all of the social media reactions to us losing, and for some reason you had a lot of the Ranger fans and the Seattle Mariner fans. Oh, you guys really suck, and I'd rather not be in the playoffs if I'm just going to lose in the first round. And one of our favorite Yankee fans,
I have good news for you.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you're a Seattle fan, you're certainly used to that by now, so fair enough.
One of our favorite Yankee fan said, just tweeted, "Ding dong, the witch is dead," and I just thought that was hilarious because of two very different reactions, Andy, from those fan bases.
Yeah, it certainly is interesting. I noticed yesterday, if you listened really closely to that broadcast, you might have heard a F the Astros chant happen during the ACLS that featured the New York Yankees and the Cleveland Guardians. Houston's not there. Houston hasn't been in the playoffs for 2 weeks now. So it's interesting that we're still living, as the internet say, rent free in their heads. But good for New York. It's about time they had something right happen in their city.
Yeah.
Eric Adams is really excited. Eric Adams is really excited that both New York teams are in the playoffs, because why would you pay attention to anything else?
That was.
I have alerted my friends who are prosecutors at the Southern District of New York that they should file another indictment for that hat yesterday.
There was a Michael Shea had that joke on Weekend Update. We might have another Subway series. We're all very excited, said Mayor Eric Adams. Yeah. Well, that's a whole other conversation. So with not being in the playoffs comes much reflection. I do want to talk a little bit about what's been going on in the playoffs, but first we'll stick with our local nine. Now that you've had a week off, Brian, to or a couple weeks since the elimination, to kind of breathe a little bit, what were some of the things that stuck out to you that made this season end up the way it did?
I think the story of the season for the Astros in the regular season was the pitching collapse in the first month and then the ability to recover. And as I think about that for next season, right, we kind of assume that Hunter Brown is the pitcher we saw in the last 4.5 months of the season and not the one we saw in the next 6 months, but that's a big question for this team, right? Mm-hmm. And this team was most successful in recent years when the pitching dominated, and they're probably going to take an offensive step back next year. So they'll need the pitching to improve next season. So that's really, that might all be internal improvement. Maybe Lance McCullers is not Sasquatch. Maybe he exists and will throw games on a Minute Maid mound. The tooth fairy may come as well for my child. Who knows? There are, things like that, I think is the real, what they do with pitching, I think is the big decision of this off season. And one of those decisions is to stick with what they have. And it's no matter where they go, that's an interesting choice, but particularly if they stick with the guys coming off of rehab, that's a very important and meaningful choice.
And I'm assuming, though, that at this point in time, Dana Brown comes in without any emotional attachment to, 30 straight curveballs or whatever it was in 2017. I'm assuming that Lance McCullers is not being counted on in his plans anymore. Do you think he learned from this past season when he just didn't show up?
I don't know how you react to the Lance McCullers Jr. issue, because at one point, you're right, you can't count on him pitching really ever again. At the other point, he takes up a roster slot. At some point, you're going to have these starting pitchers come back, and you've got to do something with them because you're going to have a crunch on the 40-man roster level. The problem for McCullers especially is I don't think it would be extremely surprising, at least, that there's any market at all for him until he can actually come back and pitch.
Not with that contract.
Which means once he comes back and pitches, he's either effective and you want to keep him, which you've got to figure out a roster spot situation. You can do that. Or you try to deal him, which means that he probably wasn't effective enough for you to want to keep. The rotation, honestly, is the one thing I'm not worried about with the Astros for next year. I think we have enough arms and enough that, and I wouldn't have said this 6 months ago, but with Fromber in his free agent season, Hunter Brown seemingly have taken that next step, and Spencer Arrighetti looking like a competent major league pitcher, albeit like a 3 or a 4, but still
Sure.
a competent major league pitcher. I'm not horribly worried about anything. Luis Garcia probably is coming back. I have better vibes on him than I do on Colors, and that's based on nothing other than history. We may get Javier, we may get Urquidy back at some point. I think they're kind of the McCullers camp where you can't count on them. But there are arms in the system, and the Astros have proven they can get starting pitching when they need it. I would like them to sign a veteran too, but it's, again, we've got so many other problems that I think the rotation is probably the one area where Dana Brown is going to let the system handle itself. I think the bullpen is similar to that, but more because of the financial constraints of the bullpen that we've built versus any desire not to improve that.
Brian, any follow up to that? I mean, the bullpen, for example, on paper looks great, particularly the back end, but we saw what paper gets you, which is, an early exit in the wild card.
Hader and Presley are coming back, and they're a big chunk of our payroll.
Yeah. They put a ton. They have generally put a ton of resources into the bullpen, both in terms of trade pieces and in terms of money, and that's been true for really going back to, Lunau did that as well, Click did that as well, and now they've done it under Brown. So I think the bullpen will stay the same. They will probably try to, find someone on the waiver wire or something maybe to add, as they've done, but no sort of big moves to add in the bullpen. Obviously the sort of second question is, what are they going to do at third base? This is also this leads to sort of another question for the offseason, which is Jim Crane going to go in the luxury tax again? Penalties go up if you go in the second year. But they are at the moment about $5 to $6 million under the first threshold. So if there's $6 million under, what will that buy you? Well, that's Victor Caratini's salary. You can get the top of the line backup catcher.
Sure.
So at third base, they could re-sign Bregman. Cost you more than $6 million, definitely. They could re-sign, like I looked at the free agent market last year, third baseman Jeimer Candelario signed for $15 million a year. Kind of our definition of sort of an average third baseman. Or they could sort of get creative and look for a player who might develop and acquire him. The Mets have Brett Beatty as someone who has failed as a prospect so far, but had lots of hype as a prospect. He's been passed by Mark Vientos. That's a potential target. So the Astros have something the Mets want. I'll know more in 7 days, right after the Mets, how they feel about their LCS. So that's going to be a big question for the Astros this offseason is what do they do at third base where they have an opening and no clear, I guess you could put Zach DeZenzo there. But I'd certainly like something more than that to have faith in for next year.
Well, to be clear, I'm sorry, Jim.
Go ahead.
That up until middle of this season, that was the plan. If Bregman doesn't re-sign, or we can't re-sign, or don't want to re-sign Bregman, it was never Shea Whitcomb, other than possibly as a stopgap for part of the season. He doesn't profile as a major league defender at third base. He doesn't hit for enough power to be at a corner in theory. DeCenzo was the guy. Now DeCenzo is getting more play at first base, and I don't know if that's more of a need thing for the Astros or a recognition that maybe he doesn't handle the hot corner the way they would like somebody to. Don't know. And I don't think anybody who's telling you they do know on Astros Twitter especially has any idea. They just know what they've seen at the major league level so far. I would love the Astros to re-sign Bregman. I think they could get a deal done. I think Bregman wants to be here. all things being equal, I think he's probably the one of two players that Crane would go out of his comfort zone for. But this isn't a regular off season. It's a season where this is the least successful season from a playoff perspective since 2016,
and a regular season standpoint.
And a regular season standpoint. You have questions in left field, center field, first base, and third base. I don't know that you can devote all your resources without some weird Otani level deferred compensation package for Bregman to address the other holes in the lineup that aren't going away, even if Bregman comes back. It's not undoable, but there's a lot of questions to answer, and it becomes a resource allocation issue. The tax piece is certainly a part of it, but at some point, you just don't have enough dollars to buy the best free agent at 5 different positions or 4 different positions. And Jim Crane has never been the guy who's going to pay for the best player at 4 different positions at the same time.
Yeah, one thing I will hope we can at least back away from is the whole Jim Crane is cheap thing.
Yeah,
he's already proven. Yeah,
that's not what I'm saying at all.
No, I know.
Payroll team, but there is an upper limit at some point to what you can afford to pay.
Yeah, Jim Crane paid the luxury tax last year. He would have paid it in 2020 had that been a real season. So he might do it. Okay. I was more confident he was going to do it last year than it was this year, and definitely confident after they signed Caratini. They went top of the line for backup catcher rather than trying to squeeze things. Again, penalties get harder if you do it sort of multiple years, though they'll lose money off the payroll in 2025. So maybe he wants to do it. I'm reading tea leaves and I don't have a lot of them to read. The biggest issue with Jim Crane, right, as far as the one thing we know is he's never signed a player to more than 5 free agent years. And if he wants to sign Bregman, he's going to have to break that rule. Will he do that? Again, he's never done it before. Could he do it this time? Again, we were saying last year he never went over the luxury tax, so we'll see what he does.
Yeah, part of me does wonder.
I agree with Brian on that point. I don't think the average value or the dollars is the issue with signing Bregman. I think it's the length of the contract. And again, if there is a player that Jim Crane is going to break his rule for, I think it is Alex Bregman. But there's so many other questions with the everyday lineup that I just don't know if that allocation makes sense.
One of the things I was thinking, though, was all of those things that happened, no 5-year deals. It was a very different Astros situation where there was a pipeline of replacements coming up.
Yeah.
The one thing, too, talking about reading tea leaves, is Chandler Rome had mentioned this in one of his articles where the Altuve publicly saying he's going to be here was big because apparently Jim Crane listens to Jose Altuve. So part of me wonders if that's enough for him to, because he didn't advocate to bring Correa back. He didn't advocate to bring Springer back. Not publicly, but the fact that he did it publicly is such a big deal, particularly for people who cover him every day.
Yeah, I think Altuve speaking up is a huge deal. I don't know if it's a $200 million huge deal. And that may be the stratosphere that we're talking about for Bregman. I mean, everybody knows the threshold now is 6 years, 151. Because that's what Matt Chapman signed for. So Crane is likely going to have to beat that deal, both in years and dollars. And it's just a matter, to me, it makes perfect sense because it's a hole in the organization. He's the guy that you understand what you're going to get. You live with the fact that he doesn't hit in April and part of May every year, but at the end of the year, it all works out. But we don't have answers in center field. We don't have answers in left field. I don't know what they're doing at first base. If that's Zach DeCenzo getting a full shot, if it's Shiner Diaz moving there full time and letting Caratini man catcher as a starter. There's a lot of moving parts. I do know that John Singleton is not the everyday answer. And I'm worried this organization is going to continue to believe that he is.
Oh, I don't think the organization believes he is for a second. I think that's why we've seen the revolving doors. If as long as we're making wishes, I think the answer would be moving. I like the idea of moving Yonier Diaz there. I do think he played an adequate first base. He was better than Jose Abreu, right? Defensively, at least. But
that
also,
is a low bar, sir.
Well, I know. But my point is, I also wonder if he's not playing in a crouch for most of the season, does some of his power come back? Because he hit for a high average, but he didn't hit the ball out of the ballpark very much. I wonder if you see some of that come back when he's not catching every day or catching,
Our issue is more of the trying to get him not to wildly swing at sliders. And so you have a more controlled swing, you can get more base hits, but you lose some of that surprise power. There's
Yeah.
probably something to your point too about fatigue, because despite what our fans believe, nobody catches 162 games a year, and
Yeah.
catching wears you out. Even catching 100 games, which I think is around where Yiner ended up, it is a draining physical prospect to do, especially if you haven't done it before. So it's one of the many questions with the everyday lineup that's going to be really interesting in February about how we're dealing with it.
There's a big picture point to make here too. One of the reasons why the Astros are kind of strapped around the luxury tax, and Andy's talking about all these sort of different areas where they could use an upgrade: left field, center field, first base, and obviously we'll see what they do at third base. The Astros have several contracts. They're going to have to pay Abreu and Montero next year.
And
That's like $60 million, right? For between the two of them.
It's something like $30 million for them. That's just dead money on next year's cap. Let's pretend we're an NBA podcast for a second. And so, and then they've got the McCullers contract, which was, sort of
very
top of the
team friendly
line
at the time, right? We were all like, look at this team friendly deal.
Yeah, I mean, like, the AAV is down, but he hasn't pitched a lot in it because their biggest concerns about it have sort of come true. And so, it's just a thing of like you don't, there's a reason they have the 5-year rule.
Right. Yes.
And and even that hasn't prevented you from, paying for sort of an extra year. You just need to be really smart with free agent signings because it's really hard to be a general manager even under the best of circumstances.
Yeah, and I think we can all agree that particularly when the 5-year rule really reared its head, there was no reason to roll the dice on some of those issues.
Yeah.
Now, one of the reasons we didn't roll the dice on one of those issues was Jeremy Pena, and there has become a lot of talk on Astros Twitter about, is Jeremy Pena the long-term solution at shortstop, or did he have a really good October 2 years ago, and that's what's carried him forward? Brian, what say you about Mr. Pena, who had good numbers at the end of the season, partly because he was so on fire at the beginning that even though he struggled down the road, it didn't do a lot to decrease his numbers.
All right. So Jeremy Pena in 3 seasons one is, he had his best 2 weeks essentially of his life during the postseason. He's not that player, but no one is, right? In his 3 seasons as an Astro, Jeremy Pena has 13 WAR.
Okay, is that good or bad?
That is good. That's over 4 a season. 4 is about all-star level. Now, much of that is from his defense, is from 2 things: playing every day and defensive value at a high leverage position. So there was a Bill James philosophy I remember reading, junior high school or high school when I was first reading Bill James, which is, bad teams focus.
You didn't get out much in high school, did you?
No.
Yeah. Okay.
All the cool kids weren't reading Bill James.
No,
that wasn't
I
the
was
way
reading
to.
Spider-Man,
that wasn't the way to
the
women over at St. Agnes and Duchenne.
I was reading Christ on Infinite Earth. I wasn't much cooler, but so
yes,
I wouldn't know.
Yes, fair enough. But anyway, bad teams focus on the problems of their best players and not enough on their worst players.
Okay.
I'm not worried about Jeremy Pena. Put him in the lineup next year, 160 games. Hopefully you get a few better hitters so you can move him down in the lineup. He's a little better when he hits 6th or 7th than when he hits 5th. But, they've got plenty of options. Don't worry about Jeremy Pena at all.
And I'm assuming same place, right? We got bigger fish to fry when it comes to our shortstop.
He was a 100 OPS plus player this year. He's a league average player. And again, a lot of that value is from defense, but guess what? You want defense from a shortstop, so that kind of works out. He is not Carlos Correa. He is not going to be a player unless something dramatic happens with his personal development that is going to be a plus offensive player. But his defense makes up for that. it becomes a matter of this kind of, on a smaller scale, the way we used to talk about Jake Myers or in years past, Martin Maldonado. The rest of the lineup is hitting. You don't care what Jeremy Payne is doing at the plate.
Yeah.
The problem is the rest of this lineup wasn't hitting consistently this year, so you had to care what Jeremy Payne was doing at the plate. And he had a very ugly playoff series, 2 games, whatever.
So did all the hitters.
And I mean, so did everybody else. But
3 runs total.
He is prone to swinging wildly at shit on the outside of the plate. Does he get better at that? Maybe. Probably not. But if he doesn't, if he's just this guy for the next 5 years, I'm okay with that because he's outside of that 2-week period every year where he can't feel the ball to save his life. And I wish we could start predicting that a little bit better. Like when you see it coming, like now's the time you're going to be injured, Jeremy. You're going to the IR for 10 days. Outside of that 2-week window that seems to come every year, he plays above average defense at a key defensive position. That's the value to the team. People buy his jerseys. I guess that's another value to the team. So a 4.1 WAR for this year, which we thought was kind of a down year, is not a bad place to be, especially when you're comparing him to the problems in left field and center field and first base.
Yeah, it's obviously, and I think we all knew this was coming, and frankly, probably we thought this would come earlier, but we're going to consistently get more and more off seasons with more and more questions. I at least feel better about the fact that the questions are offensive and not pitching. I always feel like you can acquire offense if you've got solid pitching. You are going to win a lot of baseball games that way. Am I deluded in that, Andy?
Look at what they did this year with getting Ben Gamble and Jason Hayward off the scrap heap. Again, they're not all-stars, right? But we're contributing players. We're helpful. We were good to have them on the team. It cost them 3, upper-level prospects to get a starting pitcher. It is much harder to acquire pitching, particularly starting pitching. It's great if you can develop it on your own. So this is why, again, continued development from Spencer Arrighetti next year would be a really big boon to this team. It's easier to find a league average hitter sitting on the scrap heap.
Andy, follow up to that?
And I think the Astros also recognize that Jeremy Pena has some defensive or offensive limitations as well. It's why you spend a high draft pick on Bryce Matthews and funnel most of his playing time as shortstop. He's a guy who profiles as a better hitter than Jeremy Pena. The defense is probably less at this point, so you work out that balance. But again, you find another place for Bryce Matthews in a year or two. Potentially. That's where he's played, I think, the least in the minor leagues, but he has the arm.
So did Bregman before about 2 weeks before he came out.
Yeah, he's got the arm to do it. I don't know that he has the glove to do it. And again, you can put a guy with a little bit worse glove at third base historically. So there are, the Astros organization is not without some solutions. They just don't have a lot of solutions. So you have to kind of hit on anybody who comes up or it feels like failure. We saw that a lot this year where had a lot of guys come up and not do much. So again, they're going to have to be active in free agency in a way they haven't been in a long time. They're going to have to get creative in the trade market, I think. We haven't actually asked this question. We talked about having a wealth of talent in the starting rotation. It might make sense to look at something that the fan base would consider radical, like Neeling Fromber for something that could play a position.
I do think a starting pitcher is going to be traded. That's the only asset they have to build up the rest of the rest of the team.
My caution on that is they could trade Fromber. He's 1 year before free agency. People were underwhelmed with what the Brewers got 1 year for Corbin Burns 1 year before free agency, that they get a starting third baseman out of it. So that's a useful note there. And anything else is kind of flawed, right? They'd love to trade Lance McCullers, but he has negative value. And have to trade him for another bad contract. That Christian Javier probably has value if he were healthy, but Jose Urquidy, someone who could eat innings for somebody. But again, you don't know about these guys coming back.
No, and I think it's one of the conversations that you have where what you break camp with isn't necessarily the team you have at the All-Star break, isn't necessarily the team you have for the playoffs. I can absolutely see a world where Fromber gets off to a decent start. We get a good feeling about McCullers or Garcia coming back, or you decide to sign Kikuchi or a Verlander as a back of the rotation kind of starter, and you have a luxury where you can get Fromber. I based on just one offseason, I kind of trust Dana Brown to make a good decision because there were not a lot of people who were fans of trading what we traded for Yusei Kikuchi, but it worked out. It's yet to be seen if whether or not he has that same kind of insight on position players. Although Carantini was a good signing.
I guess last topic then, before we go, any big emotional. I feel like the losing of Gary Pettis has been a little overblown. He was a great story, but it makes sense that Espada and Dana Brown are going to want to start bringing in their own people, both to run. That explains a lot of the people not renewed in the minor leagues who were told to either take the job or walk. What craziness was that, Andy?
But they were told to take a job or find other employment.
Yeah. Can you believe the Astros laid such a ultimatum on someone? Either take the job that we're offering you or leave?
Yes, that is how the general world of employment works. So I'm sorry that the baseball hierarchy in Houston had to deal with that because I guess otherwise before under Lunau they were asked what they wanted and they
yeah.
Noted touchy-feely management guru Jeff Lunau.
Yeah. No, I think
it made the potlucks they had every Friday really awkward, Brian.
I'm actually encouraged by that sort of thing because I think Dana Brown has to have the freedom to make the minor league system, the development system, in what he wants it to be because that's his job. That to me would say that Crane is less interested in that sort of thing. And I think that tracks with what we've seen over the years. Crane I'm not saying he doesn't care. He's not Drake McClain when it comes to the minor leagues, but he's more hands off, probably a lot more hands off. And so Brown should have that level of freedom. At the major league level, this is Espada's staff, and Espada wants somebody else coaching third base. And I think regardless of the negative way this is being portrayed, maybe Pettis wanted to come back, maybe he didn't. But he is not a young man, and he is not a man who is healthy. The type of illness that he's had is not something you necessarily fully recover from ever. You get better, you can cope, but it's draining traveling as much as you do as a major league coach and being on the road for what is practically 9 months out of every year. And it may just be time. And it's not without anybody we put at third base is going to have people who question them. But this is the same man who most of the fan base was griping at for sending John Singleton on a single home not 2 months ago.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is the way it goes.
Noted speed merchant, John Singleton.
Yes.
Any final thoughts, Brian?
He's 66. So if they want to move on, that's, this may be, we think it's time, even if you don't. It's the only coach they're moving on from, so it's not like it's a wholesale change. It's this one specific thing. So there's probably some sort of specific part of it. Is it's not like, to Andy's point, right? I mean, one thing you may think is like, hey, Joe Espada wants some Joe Espada guys here, and Gary Pettis has been around for now 3 Astros managers, is brought in by AJ Hinch. But broadly, this doesn't seem to be that. It just seems to be something specific here. And broadly, it's still going to be a continuation of the staff we've seen. Basically, it's the same coaching staff. The manager has changed now a couple of times, but the coaching staff has been essentially, the same guys and internal guys, right? For the last almost decade at this point. So they're pretty confident and with good reason on what they're able to do in player development at the major league level.
Well, and I think as we wrap up, and we'll talk about this a little bit more next week, but part of the reshuffling of particularly the minor league hitting coaches, we can't in one hand say we've not done a really good job of developing offense and then not understand that they might want to change the people who are in charge of developing offense. The pitching lab is staying in the same spot. So that's really, I think, what matters. For Brian, for Andy, enjoy, I guess, if you can, the rest of the LCSs. I still am predicting a Subway series. We'll be back next week Until then, for these two very handsome gentlemen, go Astros.
We are relying on Cleveland sports history. God help us all.